It started with a smile. One of those carefully practiced, camera-ready smiles that seemed effortless but wasn't. Meghan Markle walked into Godmother's bookstore in California, radiant in neutral tones, her posture straight, her aura polished. The flashes of smartphones followed her every step. Yet, hidden behind that glossy composure was something else: anticipation. She wasn't just there for a talk. She was there to reclaim a little piece of her narrative. But that's not how it played out. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because sitting across from her, under the soft amber glow of hanging lights and between neatly stacked paperbacks, was someone who knew her long before the world did. Someone who once shared dorm meals and unfiltered laughter with her. Courtney Adamo, an old college friend, now a respected author and influencer known for authenticity and simplicity. The two women were about to reunite for what was billed as a heart-to-heart discussion about friendship, womanhood, and the art of hosting. Yet within minutes, their conversation would shift the energy in that cozy bookstore and leave Meghan, and everyone watching, dumbfounded. Imagine that for a moment. Two old friends, one now wrapped in royal titles, the other in quiet credibility, sitting side by side. One striving to stay relatable, the other naturally so. Then, the moment that changed everything. A refusal so subtle, yet so symbolic, that it echoed louder than any tabloid headline. But let's rewind. This wasn't just another promotional appearance. It was supposed to be Meghan's soft re-entry into the world of public relatability. A return to her roots, before castles, courtiers, and coronations. She was here to talk about something simple: entertaining guests. Creating a home filled with joy, the event flyer said. It sounded harmless, even wholesome. But beneath the cheerful branding, this was part of a larger strategy, a rebranding effort. After the noise, after the Netflix glare, after the royal backlash, Meghan wanted to be seen as grounded again. The irony? The audience wasn't quite convinced. From the moment she began speaking, there was a quiet tension, that awkward hush that comes when charm meets skepticism. Meghan shared stories about hosting dinners barefoot, about pouring cider into mismatched mugs, about being just Meg at home. The crowd listened politely, some smiled. But a few noticed the difference between the words and the delivery. Everything she said seemed polished, rehearsed. Her laugh landed half a beat late. Her anecdotes were just a little too perfect. Then came Courtney's turn to speak. It started innocently, a simple introduction. She thanked the audience, smiled at Meghan, and said, "It's so nice to be here with my friend, Meghan." That was it. No title, no Duchess. Just Meghan. The air shifted. Those two missing words, the Duchess, carried the weight of a crown, a continent, and an identity crisis. Meghan's smile flickered. You could almost see her processing the moment, balancing the mask of warmth against a flicker of shock. The Duchess had just been demoted, not by tabloids or palace press, but by someone who once knew her before all the fanfare. And that's the twist that sent whispers rippling through the crowd. But let's be honest, this wasn't really about protocol. It wasn't about titles or tradition. It was about power. Power between two women, one shaped by royal branding, the other by quiet independence. One fighting to prove she still belonged in every circle, and another who never needed to. Do you ever wonder what happens when authenticity meets image? When someone who built an empire on realness sits next to someone who's mastered the art of seeming effortless without trying? That's what made this encounter so fascinating. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was subtle, and that made it sting more. Courtney Adamo isn't a stranger to fame. She's built a loyal following by being raw and relatable. No palace gates, no press releases. Her home, her family, her life, all documented in a way that feels real. And that's what the audience saw that night. A woman fully at ease with herself. Next to her, Meghan looked careful. There's a saying, fame doesn't change you, it reveals you. For Meghan, that evening revealed more than she might have intended. As the conversation went on, Courtney guided it toward family, values, and authenticity. Meghan tried to interject stories about her life in Montecito, but something about the tone felt off. Courtney nodded politely, but didn't feed into the grandeur. When Meghan mentioned hosting with intention, Courtney countered with being present over perfect. It was subtle, but it landed like a contrast in worldviews. The curated Duchess versus the genuine friend. And the audience could feel it. Meghan had come prepared to shine. Yet somehow, Kourtney's quiet energy outshone her. There was no malice in it, just a reflection of something real. A reminder of who Meghan once was before she became a brand. It's strange, isn't it? How sometimes, the people from our past can strip us down to our truest selves with just a few words. No arguments, no confrontation, just omission. Kourtney didn't need to deny Meghan's title. She simply didn't acknowledge it. And that made all the difference. What's more intriguing is how much that moment mirrored Meghan's ongoing public narrative, the constant tug between humility and self-importance. She wants to be seen as both the people's princess and the Hollywood powerhouse. Yet in moments like this, the mask slips, and we glimpse something raw, the longing for validation that never seems to arrive. The event continued, of course. Meghan powered through her lines like a seasoned actress, her voice steady, her smile refastened. She spoke about gratitude, community, and finding joy in simplicity. But the energy had changed. Kourtney's presence grounded the room, while Meghan's felt increasingly curated, like a showreel of sincerity. At one point, Meghan mentioned her dear friends from college days and gestured toward Kourtney. The audience clapped. Kourtney smiled politely and responded, "It's been a long time since those days." Just that. Yet the tone, gentle, measured, hinted at distance. A friendship once warm, now polite. If this had been a royal engagement, aides would have intervened, headlines managed, statements crafted. But here in California, in a small bookstore with about 50 guests, there was no buffer. Just two women sitting across from each other, one protected by no palace, one protected by no PR team. And that's what made it so compelling. Because in that silence, in that choice not to use a title, Kourtney did something no tabloid or critic could. She reminded Meghan of the one thing she can't control, how others see her. You could almost sense the internal dialogue behind Meghan's composed exterior. Was she offended? Surprised? Embarrassed? Maybe all of the above. Maybe she realized, in that split second, that her title meant less in California than it did in Windsor. For the audience, it was fascinating, like watching two worlds collide. The American informality clashing with British hierarchy. Friendship versus formality. Reality versus reputation. And through it all, Meghan trying to recalibrate in real time. One attendee later described the moment online. It wasn't tense, exactly. But you could tell Meghan wasn't expecting that. She froze for half a second, then smiled like nothing happened. It's those tiny cracks that reveal the truth. What makes this encounter more than gossip is what it symbolizes, a reckoning. Meghan's life has been a series of carefully orchestrated reinventions. Actress, activist, royal, rebel, entrepreneur. But here, in front of someone who knew her before any of that, she couldn't play a role. She was just Meghan again, and maybe, for a moment, she didn't like it. There's a cruel irony to fame. You can reinvent your story, but you can't rewrite someone else's memory of you. Kourtney remembers Meghan from before the palaces and press, before the duchesses and titles. That version of Meghan, the ambitious, hungry, sometimes overconfident student, still lingers in her eyes. And maybe that's what made this so uncomfortable. Because when someone calls you by your real name, it reminds you who you used to be. The rest of the discussion flowed as planned. Questions from the audience, laughter, polite applause. Yet the undertone never faded. Even as Meghan tried to steer the conversation toward her new projects, Kourtney subtly brought it back to authenticity, staying grounded, being grateful, connecting without labels. It was elegant, maybe even intentional. And when the talk ended, Meghan leaned in for a friendly hug. Kourtney reciprocated, warm but measured. Cameras flashed. For the viewers at home, it looked like a heartwarming reunion. For those in the room, it felt like something else, the quiet unraveling of illusion. But perhaps the most telling moment came afterward. Meghan lingered to chat with guests, her PR team hovering nearby. Kourtney, meanwhile, slipped out quietly, her book tucked under her arm. No entourage, no spotlight, just simplicity. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. So was it really a snub? Or was it something deeper? A reflection of how Meghan's quest for authenticity has become its own performance? That's the question this story raises. Because for Meghan, every gesture is now a headline, every silence an interpretation. Yet sometimes, It's the small gestures, the names not spoken, the titles left unsaid, that speak the loudest. The world saw a reunion between two old friends. But those who looked closer saw a mirror, one that showed Meghan exactly what she's become and what she's lost along the way. And as the lights dimmed and the chatter faded, one thing became clear. Titles may command attention, but authenticity commands respect. It should have been perfect. Two old friends catching up, laughter echoing off the bookshelves, a room full of warm smiles and shared nostalgia. Yet from the moment Meghan spotted Kourtney, something about the air felt heavy, like a reunion rehearsed too many times in her head and now suddenly stripped of the magic. The bookstore still smelled of roasted espresso and new paper. Meghan took her seat, her posture flawless, her grin rehearsed. Kourtney sat opposite her, unbothered, her dress simple, hair tied loosely in a knot that spoke of ease, not effort. The microphones crackled. The audience hushed. Cameras clicked softly in the background. Then Kourtney said it again. "Thank you for joining us, Meghan. Not the Duchess of Sussex. Not Her Royal Highness. Just Meghan." There it was. The line between who Meghan was and who she wanted to be. A single word erased years of branding. The crowd might not have grasped the full meaning, but Meghan did. You could see it flicker behind her eyes. Have you ever had a moment when someone's casual choice of words pierced deeper than any insult could? When the people who once knew you best remind you, intentionally or not, that they still see the old you. Before the titles, before the armor. That was this moment. The conversation began smoothly enough. Kourtney asked how Meghan balanced motherhood, business, and public life. Meghan launched into her familiar rhythm, gesturing gracefully, emphasizing mindfulness, community, and finding joy in the little things. The phrases rolled off like lines from a well-worn script. But to Kourtney, and maybe a few in the front row, it felt oddly hollow. Kourtney nodded politely, but her eyes didn't sparkle. She'd heard this version of Meghan before. She'd heard it on podcasts, in interviews, on the Netflix special. It wasn't the Meghan who used to share late-night pizza on the dorm floor, laughing until they cried. It was the new Meghan, the Duchess turned lifestyle mogul, wrapped in serenity, guarded by narrative. When it was Kourtney's turn, her tone shifted the room. "I think it's important," she said softly, "to let people in, even when it's messy. I don't think perfection builds connection, honesty does." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Meghan smiled, but her fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. Perfection versus honesty. Was that a coincidence or a subtle contrast? It's strange, isn't it? Sometimes the friend who says the least reveals the most. Kourtney wasn't attacking. She was reflecting. But reflection, for someone as image-conscious as Meghan, can feel like exposure. The moderator pivoted. "Meghan, you and Kourtney go way back. What's something about those college days that still influences who you are today?" Meghan's laugh came quick and bright. "Oh, we had so much fun back then," she said. "Kourtney was always the creative one, the calm one. I was probably the planner." She paused. "Maybe that hasn't changed." Kourtney chuckled. "You were always driven," she replied. "Always had a vision." It was kind, but distant, like a postcard from someone who used to live next door. The warmth of friendship, cooled by years apart, and paths diverged. Here's where the contradiction bites. Meghan's whole brand now rests on connection, on being authentic, open, relatable. Yet every interaction feels mediated through glass. She wants to be seen as genuine, but she can't afford to be unguarded. Kourtney, meanwhile, simply is. And that effortless authenticity made Meghan's polished sincerity look performative. The crowd could feel it too. They leaned in when Kourtney spoke, laughed easily at her anecdotes about family life in Byron Bay, her kids running barefoot through the kitchen, the chaos of creativity. When Meghan followed, the laughter dimmed to polite smiles. Was that jealousy glimmering behind Meghan's grin, or realization? Because here's the irony. In Hollywood, Meghan had been the one with star power. In London, she wore a crown's reflection. But here, in this small California bookstore, Kourtney Adamo was the one commanding the room, not by status, but by ease. The question hung unspoken. What happens when your crown stops working outside the palace? As the discussion continued, Meghan tried to bridge the gap. "You know," she said, "titles and labels can be both empowering and limiting. It's been interesting navigating that. It was a subtle attempt to reassert herself, to reclaim the narrative. The word title wasn't accidental. It floated between them like a challenge. Courtney nodded slowly. I think the best titles are the ones our kids give us, she said. Like mom or friend. Everything else changes. The audience chuckled. A few clapped. Meghan joined in, a fraction too late. What Courtney said wasn't hostile. It was ordinary truth. But ordinary truth can disarm someone who's built their life on extraordinary image. The subtext was clear. Real connection doesn't require titles. And for Meghan, that realization landed heavy. Behind the bookstore windows, the California sun slipped lower, streaking gold across the shelves. Meghan adjusted her sleeve, straightened the hem of her dress. Her composure never cracked, not publicly. But every few seconds, her gaze flickered toward Courtney, searching for some familiar spark, a shared memory to bridge the years. None came. Maybe this is the cruelest part of success. The more you evolve, the fewer people recognize you. Or maybe they recognize you too well. Do you think Meghan wondered, in that moment, if Courtney was punishing her for something? For distance? For transformation? Or maybe Courtney was just being herself, refusing to play into the theater that had swallowed her old friend whole. Whatever the motive, the impact was undeniable. Every time Courtney said Meghan, without embellishment, without reverence, it echoed louder. Like a reminder, no matter how far you run, someone still knows your real name. Halfway through the event, an audience member asked, "What's one lesson you've both learned about friendship over the years?" Courtney answered first, that it's not about how often you talk, but whether you can still tell each other the truth. Applause followed. Meghan nodded quickly. Absolutely, she said, and that sometimes you have to protect your peace. Another pause. Similar words, opposite meanings. Courtney spoke of honesty, Meghan spoke of boundaries. The gulf widened. There's an art to public performance, to appearing composed while unraveling inside. Meghan mastered that art years ago. But here, surrounded not by courtiers but Californians, the act felt out of place. The world she'd built, glossy, branded, managed, clashed against the simple authenticity of her former friend. As the event neared its end, the moderator invited final thoughts. Courtney smiled. I guess we all grow in different directions, she said. That's the beauty of life. Meghan responded quickly. Yes, growth is everything. Change is good. Reinvention keeps us alive. Growth versus reinvention. Again, two similar words, two different worlds. One grounded, one curated. The audience didn't notice the duel beneath the dialogue, but cameras did. And when clips surfaced later, slowed down and analyzed by fans, they saw what others missed. A micro-expression, a split-second reaction when Meghan heard her name stripped of title. It wasn't rage. It wasn't embarrassment. It was recognition. The realization that authenticity can't be scripted. As the applause faded, Meghan leaned in for that final embrace. Courtney reciprocated with grace, the kind of hug that ends just a second sooner than expected. Then she turned to sign a few books, her attention already elsewhere. Outside, as Meghan's SUV pulled away, her PR assistant whispered, "That went great." Meghan nodded, eyes fixed on the window. Great wasn't the word. Controlled, maybe. Survivable. But not great. She'd come for validation, to show the world she could still be both Duchess and down-to-earth. What she got instead was a mirror held by the one person unafraid to show her reflection. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest twist of all. Because behind the royal composure, Meghan Markle, the girl who once dreamed with Courtney about changing the world, had just been reminded of something she couldn't rebrand or spin. Some people will always see you for who you were, not who you're trying to be. But what Meghan didn't know yet was that the night wasn't over. Outside the bookstore, phones were already lighting up. A single line from the event was circulating online. A harmless introduction turned viral spark. And by morning, the world would be watching again. It was supposed to be a sanctuary of words, Godmother's bookstore, that charming corner of Summerlin that smelled of brewed coffee and sun-warmed pages. But that evening, under the soft thrum of conversation and the glint of camera lenses, it became a stage. And Meghan Markle, whether she liked it or not, was performing again. The sign outside was simple, hand-painted, and almost ironic. Stories that stay with you. Inside, those stories were unfolding live. Rows of people packed shoulder to shoulder, murmuring with excitement. Phones ready. Meghan's name had drawn them, but it was Kourtney's that lingered afterward. Meghan entered first, her aura unmistakable, every gesture deliberate, every movement light, graceful, rehearsed. She wasn't just arriving, she was appearing. The crowd reacted with polite applause, but there was no frenzy, no flash of royal awe. This wasn't London, and these weren't courtiers. They were Californians with tote bags and lattes, curious more than reverent. Kourtney followed moments later, casual and unguarded. She smiled, waved to someone in the back, and took her seat with the ease of someone who didn't have to prove she belonged. There was no announcement, no grand introduction. Just presence, calm, effortless presence. Can you imagine that contrast? One woman wrapped in expectation, the other wrapped in ease. It's almost cruel how authenticity exposes effort. The moderator began the evening with a warm welcome, talking about community, books, and connection. Meghan nodded along, hands folded in her lap, her expression perfectly attentive. But when she leaned toward the microphone to speak, her voice softened into that careful, deliberate tone she'd perfected over the years, the voice of empathy manufactured for sound bites. "I think home is where we can all just be," she began. "Where joy doesn't have to be curated, and love fills the space." The crowd smiled politely, but something about the phrasing, curated joy, lingered. Maybe it was too perfect, too on brand, too aware. Then Kourtney spoke, her tone unguarded and warm. "I think it's about being okay with the mess," she said, laughing lightly. "You can't have joy without crumbs on the table." The audience laughed with her, instantly relaxed. It wasn't rehearsed, it was real. And in that split second, something subtle happened. The crowd's energy tilted. Meghan noticed. You could see it in her posture. A faint shift, a tightening around the eyes. She wasn't used to sharing a spotlight that didn't revolve around her. That's the danger of authenticity. It doesn't ask for attention. It earns it. Kourtney wasn't competing. She didn't need to. Her power lay in indifference. When Meghan spoke, the room listened respectfully. When Kourtney spoke, they leaned in. A small irony, considering the Duchess had spent years mastering the art of captivating audiences. But Godmother's bookstore wasn't the royal press gallery, and charm alone couldn't hold the room. Halfway through the discussion, Meghan tried to steer the tone. "It's funny," she said. "Kourtney and I used to talk about what our lives might look like someday. And now here we are, both moms, both storytellers. It's come full circle." It was a nice line. Polished. Safe. Kourtney smiled politely, but didn't take the bait. "Yes," she said softly. "Though I think life takes you where it wants to, not always where you plan." That landed differently. Meghan blinked, just for a beat. The crowd murmured approvingly. Sometimes, authenticity feels like rebellion. Not loud, not angry, just real enough to make the performance next to it look brittle. Let's pause for a moment. Why did this resonate so deeply with the audience? Because they weren't watching a royal event. They were witnessing something human. The raw tension between two women who had once been equals, now living worlds apart, colliding under the guise of small talk. And beneath the civility, there was truth. Not hostility, truth. Meghan's truth was polished. Kourtney's was simple. Who do you think the audience trusted more? As the conversation continued, Meghan shared an anecdote about hosting guests with intention. She described serving homemade lemonade and arranging flowers from her garden, laughing about keeping things organic. It sounded idyllic, maybe too idyllic. The audience nodded, but one woman whispered to her friend, "It feels scripted." Kourtney followed with a story about her children spilling milk during breakfast and her decision not to clean it up right away. "It's fine," she said, smiling. "They'll remember the laughter, not the mess." The audience laughed again, louder this time. And there it was, relatability versus aspiration. One woman represented the attainable, the other represented the carefully unattainable. In the age of filters and brand building, guess which one people crave more? To her credit, Meghan tried to match the tone. "I completely agree," she said. "That's exactly what I mean when I talk about being grounded." But the words fell flat. The tone was too clean, too deliberate, like someone quoting authenticity rather than living it. Kourtney looked at her kindly. "It's hard, though," she said, "when people expect you to always have it together." The subtext wasn't lost on anyone. Meghan nodded too quickly. "Exactly. It's about boundaries, right? Courtney tilted her head. Sometimes it's just about letting go. That pause between them was electric. Not confrontation, recognition. Two old friends realizing how far apart they'd grown, not just in distance, but in philosophy. And for a heartbeat, Meghan's expression softened. The walls dropped. She looked almost like her old self again, the college girl who laughed freely, who didn't have to measure every word. Then she caught herself, straightened, smiled. The performance resumed. Maybe that's the tragedy of reinvention. It saves you from judgment, but costs you authenticity. While Courtney's simplicity drew warmth, Meghan's poise built distance. One woman reflected comfort, the other, control. The moderator, sensing tension, shifted topics. You've both built lives that inspire people, she said. What's something you wish people understood about that journey? Meghan leaned forward. That it's not always easy. You have to tune out noise, protect your peace, and keep believing in your vision. A thoughtful answer, safe, practiced. Then Courtney added quietly. And sometimes it means stepping out of the spotlight, even when it feels good to stay there. A few people clapped. Meghan smiled again, but the faintest shadow passed behind her eyes. Because in that single line, Courtney had said what Meghan never could. Sometimes humility means stepping down. The crowd felt it too. There was a kind of respectful silence, the kind that fills a room when truth is spoken softly but lands hard. Outside, twilight deepened. Inside, the air grew thick with subtext. Every shared glance, every polite smile carried history, unspoken words from years past. There was affection, yes, but also distance. The kind that comes when one person moves so far up the mountain they forget what the ground feels like. By the end of the night, Meghan's posture hadn't faltered once, but her energy had changed. You could see it in the way she exhaled between sentences, in the faint stiffness of her laugh. She was still smiling, still radiant, but something beneath had cracked. And when Courtney thanked her again, "Thank you, Meghan, for being here," that missing title struck harder the second time. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. A reminder that outside royal walls, she was just another woman with a story. As guests lined up for photos, Meghan kept the mask steady, posing gracefully. But behind the polite smiles, her mind was spinning. Why had it felt so different? Why had Courtney's calm confidence felt like a quiet challenge? Because for the first time in a long time, Meghan wasn't in control of the narrative. Courtney hadn't denied her friendship. She denied her myth. And in doing so, she reminded everyone, including Meghan, that authenticity can't be curated, purchased, or trademarked. It either exists or it doesn't. As Meghan walked to her car, the applause still echoing behind her, a photographer called out, "That was beautiful, Duchess." She turned, flashed a perfect smile, and said, "Thank you." But her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. Later that night, as photos of the event began circulating online, one headline stood out. Old friends, new tension. The Duchess meets her match in California. It began with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room but reshapes it. You could almost hear the air change when Courtney Adamo chose her word. Just one word. Or rather, the absence of it. Meghan. Not Duchess. Not Her Grace. Just Meghan. And in that moment, something unspoken broke through the facade. That missing title, those two unsaid syllables, carried the weight of everything Meghan had built since walking away from Buckingham Palace. It wasn't just an omission. It was erasure. A soft, smiling erasure delivered by someone who once shared her secrets in a college dorm room. But what's in a word? Why did it matter so much? For most people, a name is simply a name. But for Meghan, it was her armor. The word Duchess wasn't just royal formality, it was validation. Proof that she'd ascended beyond Hollywood mediocrity, beyond rejection, beyond the girl who never quite fit in. She had crossed oceans and institutions to become a duchess. And now, in a humble California bookstore, a single omission had stripped that armor away. Courtney didn't do it cruelly. She didn't even do it consciously, perhaps. But intention wasn't the point, perception was. The audience might not have noticed the weight behind that word, but Meghan did. You could see it in the blink she tried to mask with a smile. That split-second freeze, the brief, almost imperceptible recalibration of someone realizing that the power dynamic had shifted. It's funny, isn't it? How the higher we climb, the more fragile our sense of self becomes. Because every rung of success adds another label, another mask. And when someone calls you by your original name, not the brand, not the crown, it can feel like exposure. Meghan's mind must have raced in that instant. Did Kourtney forget? Was it deliberate? Should she correct her? Should she laugh it off? Instead, she did what Meghan always does. She smiled, performed grace, and pretended it didn't sting. But it did. Let's pause here. Think about the psychology of titles. They're not just markers of rank. They're shields. In Meghan's world, Duchess is more than etiquette. It's identity preservation. Without it, she's not the royal rebel or the modern feminist princess. She's just Meghan Markle, the actress, the outsider, the woman the tabloids tore apart. So, when Kourtney said Meghan, what she really said was, I remember who you were before all this. And that's what made it forbidden. The rest of the event played out as if nothing had happened. The smile stayed wide, the conversation polite. But beneath the surface, a current of discomfort hummed. Meghan's responses grew tighter, her laughter slightly delayed. Kourtney's tone stayed light, unaffected, but her calm only amplified Meghan's tension. Every time Kourtney addressed her, Meghan thinks, or as Meghan said. It was like a quiet defiance of royal etiquette. She wasn't mocking. She was grounding. And grounding, to someone who's built their identity on elevation, feels like a fall. You could feel the irony pulsing through the air. A duchess trying to seem ordinary, being treated as ordinary, and hating it. There's a delicate contradiction at play here. Meghan's public persona thrives on relatability. She speaks of authenticity, of being just Meg. But in practice, she's curated every detail of her image. Every appearance, every quote, every gesture is calibrated. She's built an empire on controlled intimacy. But authenticity can't coexist with control. It's either real or it's not. And that's where Kourtney's simple act, or omission, became revolutionary. By refusing to play along with the myth, she exposed the gap between the brand and the person. Later, one guest whispered to another, "Did she really just call her Meghan?" "Yes," came the answer. "Twice." The whisper spread. Then it turned into murmurs. And before the night was over, phones were recording. Clips began circulating online, some captioned innocently. Kourtney Adamo introduces Meghan Markle at Godmother's bookstore. But others weren't so kind. One headline read, "Not her Duchess anymore. Meghan Markle's friend drops the title in front of everyone." Of course, Meghan's team would later insist it was nothing, that Americans don't use royal titles conversationally, that it was casual, friendly. But perception rarely obeys logic. What people saw was a woman once hailed as royal being publicly treated as regular. And for Meghan, who's fought to control her narrative for years, that was unbearable. She tried to brush it off during the event. She maintained her tone, her composure. But those close enough to see her eyes noticed it. A flash of something raw. Hurt. Maybe. Pride. Definitely. A hint of fear, even. Perhaps that too. Because for the first time in a long time, Meghan wasn't being treated like a duchess. She was being treated like a person. And that's not the power dynamic she was used to. Do you ever notice how the truth often reveals itself in small, unintentional moments? This was one of those. The forbidden word wasn't shouted or weaponized. It was whispered through omission. Yet it spoke louder than any confrontation. Even more telling was how Meghan tried to reclaim control. Midway through the discussion, she casually referenced her royal past. "When I was in the UK, there was such an emphasis on formality," she said. "I love that here, we can just be real." It was a clever pivot, reframing the slight as liberation. The audience chuckled approvingly. Meghan smiled, a little too wide. But Kourtney's lips pressed into the faintest smile. Not mockery, not agreement. Something else. Understanding, maybe. Or quiet defiance. She wasn't going to apologize for saying Meghan's name. Nor should she have to. That's what made it sting. Meghan couldn't confront her without confirming her insecurity. She couldn't joke about it without acknowledging it mattered. So she let it hang there. That small, echoing void where Duchess used to be. But make no mistake, everyone in that room felt the shift. It wasn't about the word itself. It was about what it symbolized, the end of illusion. Once upon a time, Meghan and Kourtney were equals, dreamers sharing late-night conversations about the future. Then one became a global symbol, and the other became a quiet success story. Years later, they met again, one desperate to be adored, the other comfortable being herself. And when those two energies collided, only one felt at peace. Titles can elevate, but they can also imprison. Meghan's every interaction now carries the weight of her past. Duchess, exile, advocate, influencer. Every person she meets either reinforces the illusion or reminds her that it's fading. And on that warm California night, in a small bookstore filled with paperbacks and candlelight, one old friend shattered the illusion with a single omission. The question now was, would Meghan forgive it? Or would she, as history shows, rewrite it? As the event wrapped, Kourtney thanked the crowd once more. "It's been wonderful sharing this space with my friend Meghan," she said again, smiling. The room applauded. Meghan smiled too, but her jaw clenched ever so slightly. Later, backstage, an aide reportedly asked if she wanted to issue a formal thank you post for the bookstore's social media. Meghan hesitated. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "But make sure they use Duchess of Sussex. It's important." And that's when you realize, for someone like Meghan, titles aren't vanity. They're identity lifelines. The more the world reminds her she's just Meghan, the more fiercely she clings to the Duchess. But here's the twist no one saw coming. Kourtney's choice, whether accidental or intentional, didn't just bruise Meghan's ego. It reignited an old truth. A truth that would ripple far beyond that bookstore, setting off a quiet cultural storm about respect, identity, and authenticity. Because what started as a reunion between friends was quickly becoming something else. A reckoning about who Meghan really is when no one calls her Duchess. And by the next morning, the world would be asking that question too. But what happened after the bookstore doors closed? That's where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because the night wasn't over. Not for Meghan, not for Kourtney, and not for the image the Duchess had spent years trying to protect. The applause was still echoing when Meghan's smile began to falter. Just slightly. Just enough for anyone watching closely to notice that something behind the eyes had shifted. It wasn't the big Hollywood kind of breakdown. No gasps, no tears. It was smaller, sharper. The kind of fracture you can only see when the light hits just right. She adjusted in her seat, crossing one leg neatly over the other, her posture tightening, her fingers laced together on her lap. From afar, she looked calm, elegant, poised, the very picture of control. But those who sat near the front, those who could see past the practiced grace, saw it. The tension, the way her jaw flexed ever so slightly every time Kourtney spoke, the way she blinked a fraction slower than normal, as though willing herself not to react. That's the thing about silence. It can be deafening when pride is involved. Imagine it. You're sitting on stage, hundreds of eyes on you, cameras pointed in your direction, and the person sitting next to you, someone who once knew your every dream and fear, suddenly refuses to play by your rules. They're calm. They're grounded. They don't rise to your performance. And with every passing minute, your crown feels just a little heavier. That's what Meghan felt. And the smile was her last defense. She laughed when Kourtney spoke. She nodded at all the right moments. But the warmth was gone from her laughter. It was mechanical now, a shield. Her words, though eloquent, carried an edge. Her tone, just a touch too polished. The mask was cracking, and she knew it. "Do you ever miss London?" Kourtney asked lightly, halfway through the discussion. The question was innocent enough, but in that setting, it landed like a dart. Meghan hesitated, just long enough for the silence to turn uncomfortable. "London will always be special to me," she finally said, her voice smooth but tight. "It's part of my story. But I think home is where peace is." Peace. The word hung in the air. It was supposed to sound graceful, but there was something defensive beneath it. Kourtney smiled faintly. "That's a good way to put it," she said softly. "Peace is better than position." The audience murmured approvingly. Meghan smiled again, that same perfect smile that now looked more like armor than joy. "Peace is better than position." The line echoed in her head, looping over itself like a taunt. Because wasn't that the very narrative she'd been pushing? That she left the palace to find peace? That titles and duties didn't define her? And yet, here she was, still craving the one thing that defined her most, acknowledgement. That's the contradiction, isn't it? Meghan wants to be seen as humble, but treated as royal. She preaches normalcy, but demands reverence. She insists she's just Meghan, but winces when someone takes her at her word. And Kourtney, calm, steady, disarming Courtney, had just exposed that contradiction without saying a single unkind word. As the moderator tried to steer the conversation back toward lighter topics, Meghan leaned in, her voice a touch too bright. "Courtney and I have known each other for such a long time," she said. "She's seen me through so many chapters, from my acting days to all of this." Courtney smiled politely, but didn't jump in. She let the sentence hang. And in that silence, something shifted again. The audience could feel it, a quiet tension curling beneath the civility. For Meghan, silence was dangerous. In the royal family, silence was power. Controlled, weaponized power. But here, silence felt like exposure. So she filled it. "And I think what's beautiful," she continued, "is that we can come together now, as women, as mothers, as friends." The word friends sounded forced, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as the audience. Courtney nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said softly. "It's good to reconnect." But even that line, kind as it was, landed differently. Like something you say to an old acquaintance, not a close companion. Someone in the audience shifted. A camera clicked. The sound sliced through the quiet like a needle. It's strange how moments of tension seem to slow time. Meghan's mind must have been racing, the headlines, the optics, the way this would look when edited for social media. Was she being slighted? Was Courtney trying to make a point? Or worse, was the crowd seeing it too? She straightened again, her hands clasped tighter now. "You know," she said, her voice a little too quick, "sometimes people don't understand what goes on behind the scenes. The pressure, the expectations. It can be overwhelming." It was a pivot, one she'd used before. Vulnerability wrapped in self-preservation. Courtney listened quietly, then said, "Yes, but that's true for everyone. Not just public figures. We all feel pressure to perform." There it was again, equality. Grounding. A subtle refusal to play into Meghan's hierarchy. And this time, the smile cracked for real. It was small, fleeting, but undeniable. Her eyes hardened for a split second, the muscles in her face tightening before she recovered. But it was enough. Enough for one woman in the second row to whisper, "She didn't like that." Of course she didn't. Because Courtney had done the one thing no one around Meghan does anymore. She treated her like an equal. For a woman who has built her entire empire on being exceptional, that's the deepest cut of all. By the time the moderator thanked them for their beautiful conversation, the applause felt polite, almost perfunctory. Meghan stood first, her hand instinctively brushing imaginary lint off her dress. Courtney stood a second later, serene as ever, and turned to greet the crowd. Cameras flashed. The smiles returned. Two women, shoulder to shoulder, all warmth and grace. But the eyes told a different story. Meghan's smile was strained now, her gaze darting toward the exits. Courtney's was peaceful, content. It's incredible, really, how two people can occupy the same space and yet seem to live in entirely different worlds. When the moderator invited questions from the audience, a young woman raised her hand. "This question is for both of you," she said shyly. "What advice would you give about staying grounded when life changes so much?" Courtney answered first. "I think the key is remembering who you were before the world told you who to be," she said. "If you can hold on to that person, you'll never lose yourself." Applause. Genuine, soft, heartfelt applause. Meghan took a deep breath. "That's beautiful," she said. "And I'd add, sometimes we have to rewrite our story when others misinterpret it." There it was, a quiet rebuttal. A line that said, "I'm still in control." Courtney nodded with a faint smile. "Yes," she replied. "But even rewritten stories should still feel true." The air went still again. It wasn't confrontation. It was understanding. But for Meghan, understanding could feel like defeat. By the time the event wrapped up, the energy in the room had shifted completely. The initial excitement had melted into a sort of collective curiosity, a sense that the audience had just witnessed something real, unscripted, and uncomfortable. As Meghan gathered her things, a staff member asked if she'd like to stay for a quick photo call. "Of course," she said, her voice light but clipped. She turned to Courtney. "Let's take one together?" Courtney nodded. "Sure." They stood side by side. The cameras clicked. Meghan's hand brushed Courtney's back in a practiced gesture of familiarity, but Courtney didn't lean in. She smiled, but her posture remained her own, steady, unflinching. And that's when Meghan's smile faltered again. For just a second. Enough for the photographer to capture it. The tightness in her eyes, the subtle downturn at the corner of her mouth. That photo, innocent as it seemed, would later become the defining image of the night. The smile that wasn't real. The moment the Duchess looked human again. Because the truth is, the cracks weren't a sign of weakness. They were a glimpse of something real. Beneath the composure, beneath the titles and curated grace, there was a woman caught between who she was and who she wanted to be. But reality doesn't care about image. And the next 24 hours would prove it. Because while Meghan's team rushed to control the narrative, posting polished photos, drafting captions, curating the perfect sound bites, the internet had already moved on. The unedited clips, the subtle expressions, the missing title, all of it was spreading fast. And once the world started watching, the smile that cracked would become a symbol, not of embarrassment. The next morning, the world woke up to 1,000 versions of the same story. Photos of Meghan and Courtney filled social feeds, each one analyzed like an archaeological discovery. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Was it just friendly banter between old pals, or a calculated snub? But behind the polished PR captions and the bookstore's cozy lighting, Meghan was already at work, quietly, deliberately crafting her counterstrike. You see, Meghan Markle doesn't confront directly. She never has to. Her power has always been subtler than that, layered in charm, couched in politeness, sharpened by control. When someone publicly unsettles her, she doesn't shout. She recalibrates. It's not about vengeance. It's about rebalancing the narrative. And that's exactly what she was about to do. By mid-morning, the Godmother's bookstore event had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Headlines used words like awkward, icy, strained. One influencer posted a side-by-side photo of Courtney's calm face next to Meghan's tense smile with the caption, "When your friend forgets your title." It had 300,000 likes in an hour. Meghan saw it. She saw all of it. Her team had warned her the clips were circulating, but they'd tried to soften the blow. "It's just social media noise," her assistant said brightly. "It'll fade in a day or two." But Meghan knew better. Nothing fades anymore. Every image lives forever. So, she did what she's learned to do best, take back control through performance. By noon, a new post appeared on her foundation's Instagram page, a series of elegant photos from the event. Meghan smiling, laughing, listening intently, curated moments of grace. The caption read, "A beautiful evening celebrating friendship, creativity, and authenticity at Godmother's bookstore. Thank you, Courtney Adamo, for sharing your wisdom and warmth." The Duchess of Sussex. There it was. The counterstrike, wrapped in civility, lined with meaning. Did you catch it? That quiet insertion of the Duchess of Sussex. A title so prominently placed it felt less like gratitude and more like correction. The message wasn't for fans. It was for Courtney. It was Meghan's way of saying, "You may forget who I am, but the world won't." This was how Meghan fought. Not with confrontation, but with curation. Not through truth, but through tone. Still, for all her strategic grace, she couldn't silence the storm that had already formed. Bloggers dissected every frame of the event. Body language experts popped up on YouTube, pointing out microexpressions. "Notice the moment her smile falters," one said, freeze framing Meghan's reaction to Courtney's peace over position line. "That's a tell, classic suppressed anger." Others went deeper. "This isn't about friendship," one commentator said. "This is about control." Meghan's entire brand depends on being adored. Courtney didn't adore her. She grounded her. And Meghan can't stand grounding. Ouch. Even Meghan's supporters were uneasy. The comments under her post were polite but telling. "Beautiful event, but the energy felt weird. Love the Duchess, but Courtney seemed more authentic." Authentic, that word again. The one Meghan claims, but rarely embodies. Inside her Montecito home, surrounded by candles, fresh orchids, and meticulously arranged cushions, Meghan stared at her phone. Every headline, every reaction, felt like a critique of her essence. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She was strategizing. This was the middle ground between diplomacy and defiance, where she thrived. She'd been in this position before, criticized, cornered, doubted. And every time, she'd come back stronger, sharper, more composed. But something about this one felt personal. Because this wasn't the press. This wasn't the monarchy. This was a friend. and a friend's honesty cuts deeper than a critic's insult. So, she planned the next move, not publicly, but symbolically. The next week, she made an appearance at a local charity gala. Her outfit, minimal, timeless, unmistakably regal. She greeted guests with her practiced warmth, but there was a new intensity behind her words. "I think true friendship," she said to a reporter who asked about the godmother's event, "is about respect, mutual respect. It's about lifting each other up." It sounded harmless, but if you listen closely, you could hear the sting. Because in Meghan's world, every sentence is layered. Mutual respect was her subtle rebuke, a quiet suggestion that respect had been lacking. And once again, she had shifted the narrative, from a woman embarrassed to a woman wronged. But here's the thing about passive-aggressive power moves. They only work when your opponent plays along. Kourtney didn't. While Meghan's team orchestrated polished posts and veiled statements, Kourtney returned to her normal life. No comments, no rebuttals, no interviews. She posted pictures of her family at the beach, her children's art projects, a loaf of homemade bread. The caption simply read, "Grateful for small, real moments." It didn't mention Meghan. It didn't need to. And that quiet indifference drove Meghan insane. Because silence, when strategic, is louder than any statement. For years, Meghan had mastered the art of controlling her own story. But now someone else, someone calm, someone ordinary, was telling a parallel one without saying a word. A story of authenticity that undermined everything Meghan was trying to project. She called her publicist. "Let's do an interview," she said. "Something candid, warm, honest, about friendship." Her team hesitated. "You think it's wise to address it directly?" "I'm not addressing it directly," she said. "I'm just clarifying." But everyone knew what clarifying meant in Meghan's dictionary. It meant reclaiming the throne, even when there was no throne left to claim. So, a few days later, a glossy magazine published a feature titled, "Meghan Markle on Friendship, Forgiveness, and Finding Herself Again." The photos were breathtaking: golden sunlight, soft fabrics, that perfect Montecito glow. The quotes were crafted carefully. "True friends celebrate your evolution," she said in one. "Sometimes people grow apart, and that's okay, as long as there's love." To most readers, it sounded peaceful, mature. But to those who knew the context, it was another counterstrike. A gentle warning dressed as wisdom. Kourtney still said nothing. And that silence, again, became the loudest response of all. Behind the scenes, sources whispered that Meghan had unfollowed Kourtney on social media. Others claimed that mutual acquaintances were asked to keep distance from anyone who didn't align with the brand. If true, it was classic Meghan, strategic pruning disguised as self-care. But for every carefully calculated move, there was an undercurrent she couldn't control: public perception. The more she tried to steer it, the less believable her authenticity became. Because here's the paradox: the harder you try to prove you're real, the more artificial you look. Her next public outing only worsened things. Reporters, emboldened by the online buzz, asked direct questions. "Do you still speak to Kourtney Adamo?" one asked. Meghan laughed, too brightly. "Oh, of course. We're dear friends," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't believe everything you read." It was the kind of line that might have worked before. But this time, it didn't land. Because the internet had receipts, not of confrontation, but of truth. The cold body language. The missing title. The frozen smile. By evening, another headline surfaced. Meghan says she and Kourtney are dear friends, but her body language says otherwise. That's the trap of living life as performance. Eventually, people learn to read between the lines. Kourtney, meanwhile, continued posting quietly. No interviews, no engagement with the noise. Just moments, real ones. A photo of her garden. A handwritten note from her child. A quote that read, "Peace doesn't require an audience." And in that silence, she won again. Because Meghan's entire world depends on being seen. Kourtney's doesn't. And nothing terrifies a performer more than an audience that looks away. Still, Meghan wasn't finished. Behind every smile, there's strategy. Every gesture, a message. And her next move, subtle, calculated, deliberate, would show the world just how far she was willing to go to reclaim the power Kourtney had quietly taken from her. But that next move wouldn't happen on Instagram or in interviews. It would happen in person. And when the two women crossed paths again, the air in the room would feel entirely different. Because this time, Meghan wasn't coming to talk. She was coming to prove something. And no one, not even Courtney, saw it coming. It was a quiet afternoon in Byron Bay when Courtney Adamo finally saw the headlines. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, lighting up with messages from friends across the world. "You've gone viral," one text read. Another said, "Did you see what Meghan's team posted?" She sighed, placing the phone face down on her wooden kitchen counter. The ocean breeze drifted through the open window, the sound of her children laughing in the background. Courtney didn't need to open the articles. She already knew what they said. She had known Meghan long enough to recognize the pattern, the soft smile, the glossy statement, the art of emotional redirection. This was Meghan's way of fighting back, not with confrontation, but with performance. Always with performance. Courtney poured herself a cup of tea and finally opened her laptop. The screen glowed with headlines. The Duchess of Sussex shares graceful words on friendship. Meghan Markle addresses viral bookstore moment with poise. Meghan's heartfelt message to her dear friend Courtney. Dear friend. She couldn't help but chuckle. The words didn't sting. Not exactly. But they carried that familiar artificial sweetness, the kind that leaves an aftertaste. She knew Meghan's world now. Every word was strategic. Every photo chosen to evoke emotion. Authenticity packaged for applause. But the truth? Courtney didn't hate Meghan. Not at all. She pitied her. Because the Meghan she knew, the girl from Northwestern University, had once been real. Back then, Meghan laughed too loudly, dreamed too big, worried too much. She was ambitious, yes, but also sincere. She wanted to make a mark, to be seen, to be somebody. And she had every right to. But somewhere along the way, Meghan stopped chasing purpose and started chasing validation. Courtney had seen it happen. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like watching a friend fade under layers of makeup until you barely recognized the face underneath. Hollywood had given Meghan a stage. Royalty had given her a crown. But both had taken something in return, her truth. People online were calling Courtney brave for refusing to use Meghan's title. Brave, she thought, was too generous. She hadn't done it to make a statement. She simply called her by the name she'd always known. To Courtney, Meghan was just Meghan, not a brand. Not a duchess, not a headline. And maybe that was what hurt most for her old friend. There's a strange kind of sadness in realizing someone you once loved has become unreachable, not by distance, but by illusion. Courtney had reached out after the wedding years ago, sending a handwritten letter, a simple congratulations, proud of you. The reply came months later, a printed thank you card with a signature that didn't look handwritten at all. That was when she knew. The Meghan who used to send voice notes about heartbreak and dreams of changing the world had been replaced by someone who sent statements through a press office. Courtney looked back at her phone. Another notification, this time from her publisher. Book sales are up 60% overnight, the message said, followed by a smiley face emoji. She stared at it for a moment, torn between amusement and discomfort. Fame had found her, but not for the reasons she wanted. Meanwhile, Meghan's carefully curated post continued to spread. On social media, her supporters praised her grace. Critics accused her of manipulation. But Courtney didn't engage. She knew that responding, even gently, would only feed the narrative. And that's what Meghan thrived on, narrative control. Instead, she opened her journal, the same one she'd been keeping for over a decade. She turned to a fresh page and wrote one line. Some people confuse kindness with compliance. Then she closed it, exhaled, and went back to making lunch. Because unlike Meghan, Courtney didn't need the world to hear her truth. She only needed to live it. But that didn't mean she wasn't reflecting on what had happened. That night, after putting her children to bed, she sat outside on her porch, the stars scattered like powdered light over the dark water. Her husband joined her, handing her a glass of wine. "You've been quiet all day," he said. Courtney smiled faintly. "Just thinking. About Meghan? About what she's become," she said softly. "And maybe about what I used to mean to her." Her husband leaned back in his chair. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she said. "But it's sad. We used to talk about being authentic. About never losing ourselves no matter what life threw at us. And now, authenticity is her costume." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. There was something unspoken in the air, a shared understanding that some friendships aren't meant to last forever. Not because of betrayal, but because one person stopped being real. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in Montecito, Meghan was pacing her living room, phone in hand, scrolling through reactions. She was trying to find control in chaos, trying to read every comment, every perception, every narrative that could be used against her. It's exhausting, isn't it? Living a life where your peace depends on public approval. At one point, she whispered, almost to herself, why couldn't she just play along? Her PR advisor, sitting across the room, hesitated before answering. Maybe because she doesn't have to. That silence hit harder than any headline. Because that's what separated them now. Kourtney didn't need the world to love her. Meghan did. By the following week, the story had grown legs. Talk shows discussed it, podcasts analyzed it, and YouTube commentators dissected every frame. One host joked, when your college friend calls you Meghan instead of Duchess, that's when you know the vibe's off. The audience laughed. Meghan didn't. It was one thing to be criticized by strangers, but being exposed, however subtly, by someone who once knew her heart, that was unbearable. And yet, Kourtney wasn't exposing her. She was reminding her that royalty, fame, and influence mean nothing if they cost you your humanity. In interviews, Kourtney had always spoken about the importance of simplicity, of slow living, family, community. She had built her life around being present, not perfect. Meghan had built hers around being perceived. That difference, though invisible to most, was enormous. And so when Kourtney chose silence, it wasn't weakness. It was power. The kind of power Meghan couldn't replicate because it came from truth, not strategy. Weeks passed, and the noise eventually began to fade. The tabloids moved on to new scandals, new stories. But something had shifted, not just in public perception, but in Meghan herself. For the first time, she couldn't fix the narrative. She couldn't charm it away, couldn't outshine it. Because this wasn't the palace or the press, it was her past. And the past, once awakened, doesn't forget. Kourtney, meanwhile, continued her life as usual, writing, parenting, building her home with quiet contentment. But late at night, she still thought about Meghan. Not with anger, not even with pity, just with a sense of loss. Because somewhere beneath the crown, beneath the performance, beneath the image, there was still that girl she'd once shared late-night secrets with. The one who dreamed big and laughed loudly. The one who hadn't yet learned how to weaponize.